Hello, everyone, and welcome to the May 2021 edition of our monthly webinar series. My name is Chris Pankowicz, and I'm the Research and Knowledge Lead here at the Center for Innovation in Campus Mental Health. I welcome all of you in attendance today to share the space with us as we bring attention to the topic of sexual violence and harassment on campus. Earlier this year, the Ontario government announced a proposal of changes to sexual violence and harassment policies at our post-secondary institutions. And these are really aimed to help reduce the stigma and fear associated with reporting these experiences on campus. It is widely known that many instances of sexual violence and harassment on and around our campuses go unreported. And oftentimes this is because students are afraid of the reprisal or concerned that they will not be taken seriously. In this webinar, we're hoping to magnify the focus on this topic by first defining and contextualizing sexual violence and consent. This is going to take some time to include understanding and unpacking relevant cultural factors that are relevant to why students may not come forward to report these incidents. We will also be exploring what it means to utilize a trauma-informed approach with students who do come forward to report these incidents and how that can be applicable to any frontline staff member that may be the first point of contact. Before moving on to meeting our guests for the day, I have a few housekeeping notes. We will primarily be fielding the audience questions towards the end of the webinar. I would like to draw all of your attention to the bottom of your screens. There you're going to see both a Q&A feature and a chat feature. Please use the Q&A feature to submit questions for our panelists. I will be actively tracking these throughout the webinar, and if the opportunity does arise to bring a question to the attention of our presenters prior to the end of the webinar, I'll try my best to do so. For all other inquiries or comments, please use the chat feature. We do encourage you to use this function to connect with each other and share thoughts and perspectives as the webinar is occurring. Final point in the housekeeping notes, we do send out a brief feedback survey after the webinar is finished, and you should receive that via email after the session. It will be greatly appreciated if you can take a moment to fill that out. And now time to do a little intro to each of our presenters who's joining us. First, I have Alex Donaldson, who's currently a Master of Social Work candidate at Wilfrid Laurier University. She has over 5 years of experience providing support to diverse women and youth experiencing mental health, including working as a youth counselor at the Sexual Assault Center of Brant. She is passionate about reducing systemic barriers for people experiencing IPV and sexual violence and works to collaborate with community partners to support those at risk. Isabella Juga is a counselor at the Durham Rape Crisis Center with a focus on youth support. She has diverse work experience in feminist agencies, including violence against women shelters and emergency housing nonprofits across Durham region, including Girls Inc. of Durham, Bethesda House, Horizon House, and Joanne's House. Isabella dedicates her career to supporting and advocating for youth and women. She believes in being client-centered and empowering individuals to love and be their best selves through strength-based and solution-focused therapy. And last but not least, I have Tanya Montebello, who is a clinical counselor at the Durham Rape Crisis Center and also holds committee memberships on Trent's University's Social Work Community Advisory Council, the Concord Addicts Survivors Fund, and the Durham Region Francophone Community Health Table. As a previous caseworker for a Legal Aid Ontario Community Clinic, she also advocates in areas of poverty, sexual and domestic violence, and disabilities. Tanya believes in an anti-oppressive approach and practices with a commitment to social justice. She also served for 3 years in Afghanistan as a civilian with the Canadian Forces. With that being said, I will graciously pass control of the session on to Alex, who's going to lead off the session.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, let's see if I can do this correctly. Okay, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see it? Perfect, okay, great. All right, so this is just a little bit of our agenda for the day. First, we're gonna define sexual violence, talk about more systemic violence in our culture, intersectionality, do some definitions, talk about trauma symptoms, trauma-informed approach, and some practical ways to support. So we'll start off with what is sexual violence? So sexual violence, though often just connected with the idea of rape, can happen in many ways and in many situations. Sexual violence means that someone forces or manipulates someone else into unwanted sexual activity without their consent. That can include any unwanted sexual comments or advances, any attempts to traffic, or use of coercion to obtain sex by any person regardless of their relationship. Some might be able to verbally agree to sexual activity, but not able to consent. So reasons someone might not be able to consent includes fear, age, illness, disability, and influence of alcohol and other drugs. Anyone can experience sexual violence at any age and in any situation. So sexual violence in our culture, it is often referred to as rape culture. Rape culture attempts to normalize assault, violence, and rape. Rape culture exists when sexual violence becomes normalized and excused in our society. Traits of rape culture include objectifying women's bodies, encouraging sexual aggression, condoning physical or emotional abuse, and victim blaming. One of the places in which rape culture continues to be normalized is on campuses. Many campuses can mishandle rape cases and can have a tendency to downplay the severity of these situations. Victim blaming is an important element of rape culture because it normalizes rape culture and contributes to victims not wanting to report these incidents. This puts pressure on victims, particularly women, to change their behavior to avoid getting assaulted or raped. So there's some common phrases that you might hear that is part of this rape culture. And here's just a few examples, but I'm sure you could think of many more. So women ask for it on how they dress, and men will be tempted by how you dress. So this puts responsibility on women for men's actions and feelings. They took too long to report it, so they must be lying. So sexual violence is trauma, and some people need to unpack that trauma before deciding whether or not to report a case. It has nothing to do with how long it takes to report. They just want attention or money. So there's already an extremely low report rate for sexual violence. Most people do not want to have attention drawn to that. And the the statistics for false reporting is extremely low. They just hate men. It's important to remember that men are also victims of sexual violence, and assault is a crime that can happen to anyone. It's not about hating men. You let him on by going to a dorm room, making out with them, dating them, etc. So dating someone does not mean that you're guaranteeing sexual activity, and it still is an assault, even if you're dating somebody or a partnership with them if they don't consent. But the person denied it, and he's a great person. So anyone can consent or can commit assault, even if you see them as a good person, even if you have a relationship with them. It doesn't mean that assault can't happen. So how do we combat rape culture and victim blaming? So here's just a few suggestions. So avoid using language that objectifies or degrades women. Speak out if you hear someone else making an offensive joke or trivializing rape. If someone says they have been raped, take it seriously and be supportive. Think critically about the media's message about women, men, relationships, and violence. This includes movies that portray abuse as protective and love. Be respectful of others' physical space, even in casual situations. Hold abusers accountable for their actions, and do not let them make excuses blaming the victim. Always communicate with sexual partners, and you cannot consume assent, or assume, not consume. Define your own gender roles and don't stereotype, and be an active bystander. So intersectionality. So why is it important in the framework of sexual violence? So intersectionality is a unique form of discrimination faced by people living at the intersection of multiple marginalized identities. An example could be a Black woman who is at the intersection of both racism and sexism. So you can see on this slide, there's lots of different intersections, gender expression and language, marital status, education, ethnicity. And on the left side, you can see a little wheel where the closer you are to the center, so you can see the one that's highlighted is male and female, which is just a binary of gender, but we'll take it for this example. So males are closer to the center, so they're closer to the power of what holds in that society, and females are further from the center, so they hold less power. So if you're more than one of the things that hold less power, then you have less power in the society. The closer you to the center, you hold more power in society. And that can be different based on which society you're in as well. So sexual violence already disproportionately impacts BIPOC and LGBTQ+ communities, but those who live at the intersections of multiple marginalized identities experience sexual violence at higher rates. Intersectionality allows us to understand barriers that people face when choosing to disclose or report their experiences of sexual violence. For example, Black women are less likely to report their experiences of sexual violence out of fear of not being believed or not having access to culturally competent resources. Men convicted of raping white women face harsher penalties than men convicted of raping Black women. To encourage change, it is important to make space and encourage diverse voices and value those perspectives equally. To end sexual violence on a systemic level, there must be a commitment to dismantle oppression and more advocacy and understanding for women of color, Indigenous women, trans and gender nonconforming individuals, people with disabilities, and other marginalized groups as survivors of sexual assault. We must also work on campuses to identify and engage in efforts for white people to dismantle white supremacy. This includes the idea that westernized practices are superior and preferred.
Okay, so what is consent? Consent is one of those concepts that should be very simple and clear-cut. However, with reality, based on circumstance, it can be quite complex. So here I have a definition for you from the Criminal Code of Canada. Consent is defined as a voluntary agreement or permission given to engage in the sexual activity in question. The individual can freely choose what sexual act to engage in without pressure, coercion, force, or threat. So essentially, it is permission. There are two forms that consent comes in. So we have verbal consent, pretty straightforward, using words such as yes or an enthusiastic verbal expression to communicate their agreement or permission to engage in the sexual act in question. And we also have nonverbal consent. This is where things can get a little unclear because, again, there is it's nonverbal. So this includes features such as body language, facial expressions, eye contact, communicating the agreement or showing discomfort in various methods other than words. So this can include avoiding eye contact or any type of avoidant behavior. In those circumstances, consent is not given. Although it is both parties' a responsibility to ensure their partners willingly consenting to the sexual agreement, the person initiating the encounter must ensure that all participants are comfortable, willing, and sober. On the next slide here, oh yeah, there we go. So this is just one tip for those of you who are in the helping profession, supporters of survivors, whether you're teaching consent from a prevention education platform, individual counseling, group counseling, anything at all. If you are teaching consent, it is very important to have those tools in your toolbox. This is my favorite, and I'm sure many of you have heard of this before. It's from Planned Parenthood. It's called the consent fries. So this in particular, we have F is for freely given, R reversible, so it can be taken back at any time, informed, E enthusiastic, and specific. There are other tools out there that you can find online. So if you are interested in teaching consent, I would encourage you to do some of your own research. There is another video out there on YouTube called Consent Tea, you know, like tea and coffee, so TEA. which I heard is also a great tool. So just keep in mind that although it can be a bit tricky based off of circumstance, if you have a survivor or any individual asking you about consent, there are tools that you can use to help you explain and kind of go into more detail about what consent is all about.
Okay, hello everybody. So this next section is going to focus on trauma. So why trauma? Well, if we're going to learn to help those who have experienced sexual violence, we must first learn about trauma. So I've posted this definition. Essentially, trauma is the response that results from exposure to an injury or an unexpected event. It presents as a physical and or a psychological threat to ourselves or to others, and which is outside of our control. And it generates helpless, fearful reactions, intense feelings of powerlessness, and it overwhelms our individual ability to cope. Now, trauma may result from a single event or from multiple repeated events. And exposure, it may have taken place in the distant or the recent past. And trauma-inducing events, they include such things as accidents, natural disasters, war, or most commonly exposure to violence at home or in the community, including sexual violence. Therefore, the survivors of sexual violence that you will encounter and wish to support will most likely be experiencing symptoms of trauma. So it's important to know what these symptoms are if you wish to better understand and connect with these individuals so that you may properly help them. Okay, so on to trauma symptoms. I've laid those out for you because they're very helpful to be very familiar with. So this is a list of common symptoms that are associated with trauma. Now, it's really important to understand that not everyone who's experiencing trauma may necessarily be affected by all of them. And the level of severity of each symptoms is going to vary with each individual, okay? So trauma symptoms are usually intrusive and avoidance-based, and they impact changes in arousal, our cognitions, and our moods. So they include intense physiological and psychological reactions when exposed to triggers that remind us of the traumatic event. These include such things as anxiety, panic attacks, and flashbacks. There's also dissociation, which is an unawareness of current surroundings. There's repetitive, distressing memories, dreams, and nightmares. There can also be somatic pain and dysfunction that's not always supported by medical explanation, such things as headaches, nausea, joint, muscle, or abdominal problems. There may also be difficulty adhering to a consistent sleep routine. There's often hypervigilant behaviors to assure safety, such as being easily startled, nervous, or taking on extreme safety behaviors. There may also be self-destructive behaviors, such things as substance abuse, self-mutilation, and eating disorders. There may also be difficulty concentrating on tasks and on other people, and an impaired memory capacity. And next slide, please, Alex. Thank you. There may also be avoidance of or maladaptive safety behaviors related to the thoughts, the feelings, and external reminders, such things as people, places, activities, situations, objects that are connected to the traumatic event and that arouse distressing memories. In addition, there's often chronic and distorted negative beliefs about ourselves, about others, and about the world around us. There may be ongoing feelings of anger, depression, guilt, blame, powerlessness, passivity, fear, and personal responsibility about the event. There may also be decreased interest in activities and a sense of detachment from other people and a sense of numbness. We may have difficulty regulating and controlling our emotional impulses. We also may have challenges in relationships with other people. So this is due to an inability to trust, to fears of criticism, of rejection, of intimacy, of abandonment, or on the other hand, it could work the other way. We may be overly trusting. We may avoid sexual activity, or on the other hand, may become promiscuous in our sexual activity. We may also have an altered sense of meaning about ourselves and about the external world. For example, we may feel confused about our self-identity. Our belief system may feel diminished. We may have a negative future outlook, or we may doubt that other people are safe. And we may have a sense of hopelessness or despair, or on the other hand, unrealistic optimism. As well, actually, could we please go back? Sorry, thank you. I just want to be clear that the term trauma is often used interchangeably in conversation with the term post-traumatic stress disorder, what we commonly refer to as PTSD. So it's really important to understand that these two things are different. PTSD is the most common of various mental health disorders that can potentially result from a traumatic experience. So basically, we can experience trauma without necessarily being diagnosed with PTSD. However, many sexual violence survivors are often diagnosed with it. So what separates PTSD from the experience of trauma symptoms? So like trauma symptoms, post-traumatic stress disorder is based on criteria that includes a re-experiencing of the traumatic event, avoidance of trauma-related stimuli, and a numbing of general responsiveness and persistent arousal. However, in order for someone to actually become diagnosed with PTSD, they require a specific number of symptoms to be consistently present for a set period of time, 1 month plus. And based on duration, it can either be specified as acute PTSD, which is a duration of less than 3 months, or chronic PTSD, which is a duration of 3 months plus. Okay, so on to the next slide, please. Thanks, Alex. So now what I'd like to do, I thought this would be useful. I'd like to explain the physiology of trauma. And this hopefully will give you an understanding of what it's like for someone to live with trauma, okay? So most of us, ideally, we strive to live a balanced life that's punctuated by feelings of safety, effective regulation of our thoughts and feelings, a realistic adaptation to situations, and an ability to express empathy, openness, and curiosity. Also an awareness of others and our own boundaries, and a capacity to live in the present moment. So if you look at that middle section there, when we do, our nervous system operates within what's called its optimal arousal zone, and our mental and physical health here are at their best. This is known as living within our window of tolerance. So without proper supports and resources, survivors of trauma and sexual violence, they often struggle to physiologically remain within this optimal arousal zone. We tend to alternate between two different extremes, as you see, going up to the top or going to the bottom. Those are the two extremes, meaning that we are living outside of our window of tolerance. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to invite all of us to try to imagine ourselves in this place that I'm going to explain to you. And this is what we would often face if we're experiencing trauma. We may experience too much consistent arousal, also known as hyperarousal. This means that our sympathetic nervous system is often operating at a fight, flight, or freeze defense response, despite us actually not being in present danger. Now, this state is characterized by tension, by emotional reactivity, feelings of overwhelm, racing, obsessive thoughts, intrusive images, panic, and anger, hypervigilance, and impulsivity. So then survivors may alternate to experiencing too little arousal, which is also known as hypoarousal. And this is as a response to being chronically stressed from being at that hyperarousal level, okay? So this means that our parasympathetic nervous system has immobilized our responses at this point, which results in quite the opposite effect. It results in numbing of emotions, reduced physical movement, passivity, disconnection, a lack of energy, an inability to defend ourselves or to say no, feelings of shame, and an absence of sensations, okay? So both of these states, they increase our risk of declining physical and mental health. And as you likely can all imagine, constantly living between these two states would be very problematic and very painful. So therefore, our goal here is, whether as practitioners or as educators or as helpers, is to support the person as much as possible that we're working with, so that we may more effectively and consistently feel encouraged, so they may feel more encouraged and learn to move to an optimal state of arousal rather than fluctuating between the hyper and the hypo states. Okay, so on to the next section. So what is a trauma-informed approach, given all that we've learned about trauma thus far? So it's only logical, right, to note that we must apply this knowledge that I've been speaking about in some way that best serves survivors' recovery. So how do we do that? So first, it's very important to understand three things, and I've listed them here again because I think these are critical to keep in mind if you really want to know about a trauma-informed approach. So trauma-informed approaches allow survivors of sexual violence to build trust and to build confidence, because when they have that trust and confidence, it's going to be much easier for them to work on their healing and recovery. And most importantly, without being further traumatized than they already have been. So the second point is a trauma-informed approach assumes that survivors of sexual violence, they may also have multiple additional adverse childhood experiences that contribute to the severity of their trauma. Okay, making it that much more complex and complicated. So the primary goal is to recognize survivors' current problems within the context of their traumatic experience and to understand how adversity may have formed their often maladaptive coping skills. So on to the next section, please. Thanks, Alex. So there are four key principles to facilitating a trauma-informed approach. Now note that these are not only applicable to sexual violence survivors. So if you're working with anybody who's experienced trauma, it doesn't necessarily have to be sexual violence. You can use these same principles to assist them and support them. So the first thing we need to do, if we say and we promote ourselves as being trauma-informed, we actually have to promote an awareness of trauma. And we do that within our organization, first of all. So the organization and its leaders, they must create a culture that promotes trauma-informed care. So staff and survivors must have the opportunity for training and to learn about trauma. So how symptoms are often attempts to survive. This is very important for us to all understand. And we also need to know about trauma's relationship to mental and physical health. Also, very important, we have to take into account cultural and gender diversity in order to best serve trauma survivors and sexual violence survivors. So the next step would be focusing on safety and trust. So what we need to do here is we need to create a sense of safety, because this is fundamental, because survivors struggle to feel safe. This is one of the main issues that they have, because they've had their boundaries so deeply violated. So the focus needs to be placed on creating trusting relationships with survivors and consistency in all our day-to-day operational activities, and even within our location where we operate. And we do this so we can create predictable expectations for survivors. The next step would be providing opportunities for choice, for connection, and for collaboration. Now we do this by having services designed in such a way that equalize power imbalances and that allows survivors to practice self-determination and efficacy. Remember, survivors, one of the key things that's happened to them is that they had their power completely taken away from them during that time of violation. So this is very important. So connections need to be initiated through open and non-judgmental communication, and also through making external community resources available to survivors. And the last point would be emphasizing strengths and skill building. So we need to have supportive services that focus on helping survivors to identify their personal strengths, to teach them more effective coping skills that center them in the present moment, because survivors are often living, again, in the future, or in the past, and are at these altered states of arousal. So living in the present moment is very important to get them back into that optimal arousal zone that I was talking about. And also we have to help them develop their resiliency through the strengths and skill building. So next slide, please. So finally, I'd like to leave this with you. 4 important things to know. I thought this was really critical to understand. So when preparing or beginning to speak with a survivor in your work, these are some key points to keep in mind, and I think they will really help you to feel more comfortable yourself when you are faced in a situation where you do have to speak with a survivor of sexual violence. Remember, okay, first of all, sexual violence can happen to anyone, and survivors are going to respond in different ways, okay? So try not to express surprise by who or what you encounter at all right? The second point is sexual violence. It's important to note that it has very many devastating effects on many areas of a survivor's life. So it's important for you to know that when you're speaking with survivors, it's always going to be at different stages of their recovery process. They may be in one spot one day and they may be somewhere backward another day, and so on and so forth. So it's important to recognize that. And it's very normal. The other thing is, while it's good for you to have personal and learned knowledge, this is actually quite important and helpful, and it can really create a connection with another person to have that. But unless you've actually walked in their shoes, you cannot genuinely understand a survivor's experience, okay? And finally, as you begin speaking with a survivor about their experience, the most important thing that you can do, okay, is make them feel safe, make them feel comfortable, and express patience, express respect and compassion. That's going to be very important to them, and it's going to help you immensely in moving forward toward healing and recovery with them. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass you back to Isabella. She's going to kind of give you ideas about practical tips that are in relation to those key principles that I discussed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanya. And I just wanted to also say thank you to Alex as well in supporting us and getting us to this point. So as Tanya mentioned, we've talked about what is trauma. Alex talked about rape culture, intersectionality, and Tanya also talked about working from a trauma-informed approach. So all of these aspects and concepts are so important to know kind of in the background for us to get to this point of working with survivors. So what do we do? How do we do this? How do we utilize all of the information that we've ever learned to working specifically with survivors? So I've done this in a way, and please keep in mind that there is so much information and knowledge out there specific to working with survivors. So I've designed this in a way that hopefully I can touch on as many points as possible. But again, I encourage you, if this is something that you are interested in, if you are working with survivors, continue to do your own research and gain as much knowledge as possible. Because this list is only some of the ways that you can support survivors. So the first step here is to create a safe space. And please note that there will be some overlapping information between myself, Tanya, and Alex, because there's some really crucial, important pieces. So as I mentioned, creating a safe space. How do we do that? Well, a private environment would definitely help, possibly of the survivor's choice if possible. So this obviously depends on the setting. We also have confidentiality. So confidentiality is crucial for both parties, the worker, the helper, the professor, whoever the helping professional is, as well as the client. So you want to make sure that the client is aware of what your limitations are as their support person. If you are working with an institution or an agency, you should have some sort of confidentiality agreement or policies that I would encourage you and suggest to review and make sure you have a fairly good understanding about this. As I said, it will really help define the boundaries, and your client will have a really good idea of what your limitations are as their support. Next on our list here is we have active listening, essentially just being present, really hearing what the survivor is saying. This leads me to my next point of giving space and allowing for moments of silence, especially during a disclosure. This may seem quite difficult. As the helping person, we want to make sure we're jumping in, we're supporting them to the best of our ability. We just really want to be there. However, sometimes just taking that step back, allowing the survivor time and space to tell their story in a very calm manner, giving them the space and the respect that they deserve is so, so, so important. Those moments of silence as well, again, allow the survivor to take the time that they need while giving you the time to process and decide how you want to move forward. The next point here, Tanya mentioned, we have rapport and trust building. This is so, so, so important for a working relationship with a survivor. As Tanya mentioned, when speaking from a trauma-informed approach or perspective, we need to acknowledge that the survivor has had their trust broken, and most likely more than once, in various relationships, whether it was a part of their violence or not. And having a healthy working relationship with a counselor or a working professional can be really, really important. And all of these things that I'm talking about will also support you in building that trust and rapport. So everything is very much connected, you will see. We also have judgment free. So this is a pretty important point as well, because it's all fine and dandy to say, yep, I'm non-judgmental, I don't judge people, I've heard the craziest things and things don't faze me. The reality is we're human beings. We all come from different backgrounds, different experiences, and it's very, very natural to have our own biases. And that's okay. But the important part of this is that we need to recognize what those biases are and educate ourselves on the myths and misconceptions, stereotypes, etc., in order to properly support the individual, because at the end of the day, it is their journey. It is not our journey. Our sole purpose is to be a support. It is not there to provide advice, to tell the person what to do, to change their mind or to change their perceptions. Changing perceptions, of course, in an appropriate and healthy way, but if we are putting our own biases on that person, they will not be healing and recovering at the level that they need to be. Following up and reliability. This is a really interesting point that I think is important to also bring up. I actually have quite a few clients that have told me that they've had past experiences with counselors that will show up late, they're constantly canceling, they're not reliable. How are you supposed to maintain a good rapport and continue to build trust if you are not following up and you are not a reliable support in that person's life? So try to be mindful of how active you are in that working relationship with your client, and obviously within reason. And that brings me actually to my last point of being transparent. If you are unsure of how to fully support this person, being transparent and letting them know, this is not something that I'm familiar with, but I want to make sure that I'm supporting you to the best of my ability. So let me find those resources for you. It is easier and beneficial to be as transparent as possible rather than lying to your client, as that will not be helping anyone. I would say as a working professional, it's also an ethical obligation to be as honest as possible and transparent. And the last on that list, I know I kind of skipped one, but just being understanding and patient. As Tanya was mentioning, a person's recovery can be just like grief. There's no simple answers. It's all over the place. We can be going back, we can be going forward in a recovery process. And so just understand that that is normal and that is natural. So as a practitioner, try to be as understanding, as patient as possible so that survivor feels comfortable in the space that you've created. Okay, so step 2 is empowering the survivor. So as I mentioned before, there will be some overlap, but essentially, how do we empower the person? Well, believing them is, I would say, one of the most important parts in empowering a survivor. You want to ensure that you're validating their feelings and their experiences. You also want to provide them with options and allow them to make their own choices. Survivors have experienced trauma. They have experienced a sense of power and control that has been taken from them. We need to now build them back up by allowing them options as simple as, when are you available for your next appointment? Tell me a day that works best for you. It can be as simple as that, providing them with options, making them feel like they are somewhat in control of their recovery journey. Showing respect is also a must, and that one's pretty self-explanatory. No victim blaming. So again, this is going back to getting to know our own biases and educating yourself on the myths and misconceptions of rape culture. And lastly, we have a strength-based approach. So this is, I would say, crucial in therapy, especially with survivors. And these 3 little points here is not going to give you all of the information that you need about this form of counseling or therapy. However, it's an idea, and I would encourage you, if you're not familiar with this approach, then to, again, do your own research on it. Essentially, what this entails is skill building. Allowing the survivor to build the skills necessary to move forward. Improving their self-esteem. Again, there are various ways of doing this. And lastly, we have focusing on strengths rather than weaknesses. I would say that this is a pretty good summary of what a strength-based approach means. We are essentially finding the benefits and strengths that come from trauma. An example that I really like to use to give people a good idea of what this might look like is survivors may have a struggle or have some issues around boundaries, whether they are too porous or too rigid or a mixture of both, and finding that happy medium can be really, really difficult. And so naturally the survivor may feel as though they attain so many negative qualities because of their lack of boundaries or their rigid boundaries. And realistically, yes, there's going to be positives and negatives to everything. And usually it is easier to look at the more negative effects of the boundary issues. However, if we look at the bigger picture, and the more you get to know your client, you will most likely recognize that, for example, if you are working with a survivor who has very rigid boundaries and they're telling you, it's so difficult for me to, get close to people, have relationships, friendships, romantic relationships, anything of that sort. I don't allow people to get close to me. Okay, sure. As I said, there are some cons to that. However, there's also pros. Out of all of these years of having rigid boundaries, you've managed to protect yourself. How powerful is that? Being able to, through your trauma, you've developed the skill to protect yourself. That in itself can be so empowering and eye-opening to survivors. So really paying attention to not just what they're telling you, but really the whole picture. Okay, and so first, step 3, knowledge of community resources. So we can acknowledge that each survivor is going to have different needs, whether it's housing, medical, financial, mental health, need of shelters, etc. So having knowledge of the various community resources will assist you in supporting the survivor to the best of your ability. Connecting and providing advocacy to community resources can display a level of commitment and care to a survivor, which in turn will support you in bettering your working relationship and rapport with the client as well. Okay, so we today have shared lots of information with you, and I can say, I've been in webinars before, and it's truly difficult to remember absolutely everything, all of the tips and all of the information shared. So I figured this might be a good place to kind of end how to work with and respond to survivors. 3 main points that you really want to recognize, and they're very simple, I promise. You play a significant role in the survivor's recovery. What you say can impact the survivor in both negative and positive ways, but essentially we're just going to keep it simple. Go back to the basics. Take a deep breath, ground yourself, listen and really hear what the person is telling you. Believe their story And again, just be there. You want to avoid saying things such as, why didn't you fight back? It's not that bad. You shouldn't have been drunk. You should not have worn that outfit or been out that late, etc., etc. Going back to some of the points that Alex had mentioned at the beginning of our webinar today. So you want to try something like this. Thank you for trusting me with your story. I believe you. You are not alone. This wasn't your fault. Can I do anything for you? And so here is more of an in-depth example of a response to a disclosure. Thank you for telling me. That sounds really hard. I'm sorry that you had to go through that. I want you to know that I believe you and that I'm here for you. You didn't ask for this, and it's not okay that it happened. As you can see, I highlighted our next point here. How can I support you? I know about some resources that can be helpful to you. Do you want to hear about them? So before we move on to the next slide, I just wanted to again highlight how can I support you? This is another main point that you don't want to forget. How I want to be supported is definitely going to most likely differ from the way that Chris, Tanya, or Alex wants to be supported. So asking them, again, providing them with the choices, the options, empowering them to tell you how they want to be supported. And going back to the resources, they may not be in a stage where they're ready to hear about the resources. So rather than, just bombarding them with a bunch of different resources, although you mean well, they might not be ready for that. They may feel pressured. So asking them, do you want to hear about the resources? And that's all for me.
Yeah, so this is just, thank you, Isabella and Tanya. So this is just some of the learning outcomes we hope you've taken away from today. So understanding sexual violence from a systemic lens, understanding the important terms like consent, trauma, and working with a trauma-informed approach, and practical ways to support survivors. So these are some contacts for more information, and you can also look up your local victim services and sexual assault centers, which will be different depending on the region you're in.
Thanks, Alex. So at this point, what we'd like to do is we'd like to leave this with a summary takeaway, and we think this is very important. So of course, the presence of sexual violence and the resulting effects of trauma, they're quite significant, particularly among the student population. So we believe that students need continued support, they need continued education, and that comes in the form of appropriate professional resources and services. Therefore, we are advocating that a serious investment in students' physical, their mental, and their emotional well-being require for institutions to allocate much needed funding in the areas of sexual violence and of mental health. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all three of you for putting together, I think, just a really well-rounded, thorough, and pragmatic series of slides to help us understand this topic at more depth and give us some tangible takeaways of how we could be a part of shifting how to work in these situations, and sharing also just your experiences as helpers in this space. We do have a few questions here. I'm just going to start reading them out, and I will allow anyone who chooses to take the first stab at answering the question, or a collective response can be given. So the first one is, as we have mostly been virtual along with our students, we have seen many disclosures happening over group chats and other formats similar to group chats. What are your thoughts and/or advice when this occurs as helpers in this space, or any sort of thoughts on that? So I'll pass it along to whoever wants to respond to that question.
I can give that a start, that maybe.
Sure.
Critical thing here would be, of course, to validate that disclosure. The worst thing we could possibly do is to kind of gloss over it like we didn't see it, didn't hear it. So given that there's a lot of people involved, what I would personally suggest is perhaps sending that person a private message at some point and just saying, hey, I saw what you disclosed there. That's, I'm so sorry that you're experiencing this or you did experience this. Is there any way that I can help you, support you? Do you need anything? That would be the first thing to do. The critical piece there is validating and not ignoring. Very important.
Yes, basically, I was going to say the same thing. I would just like to maybe add on there. Before I'm unclear as to what exactly the virtual setting was, whether it was a class or a group of some kind, but before starting whatever this virtual session is, letting people know that if there are any disclosures of sexual violence or abuse of any kind, that you have an open door policy, letting them know that even if they're not comfortable disclosing it in the group setting, they can contact you privately. And then in addition to Tanya's point, I would also just mention, as I mentioned in one of my slides, is following up. So not only can you reach out to that person and let them know that you were there for them, but also following up at a later time to ensure that they're being as supported as they can be.
Thanks so much to both of you. Next one is a comment more than a question, but something you're welcome to give some feedback on. It's interesting you continue to use the term rape. Agencies here in Alberta are moving away from this term, as firstly, it's not in the criminal code, but perhaps more importantly, it marginalizes other equally traumatic crimes or experiences of sexual touching or harassment into a domain outside of the scope of our investigation. So survivors reduce their experiences as not qualifying as rape when indeed they are as survivors as well. So I'll throw that one out to the group as well.
I can perhaps answer that as well. I can start that process. I think we have to look at the context of time when thinking about this question or this statement. We have to remember that the term sexual violence has really evolved as we've become more open to its reality. So back in the past, you'll notice that a lot of centers were called rape centers, right? Rape crisis centers. That's because that was the one thing, we hear about it, we see it, it's there. It's like, wow, that's terrible. It was very clear, right? There's that, that stranger, that physical assault, that component of it. But again, it's evolved over time as we've become more open and we've just more open to the definition of what sexual assault actually means, sexual violence means. I think that has become a bit fluid now, that term rape. You're right, it doesn't necessarily accurately reflect the point we're at today of acceptance of the term sexual violence. And as we're opening up more to it, I think you'll notice that term will eventually change as well. So we won't use it as much. Unfortunately, it's not as easy, I guess, to change names of centers automatically. But rest assured, that is something that's in process for many. I hope that helps.
Sounds great. Thank you for the detailed response, Tanya.
Yeah.
Next question. In a university setting, there have been times when we as counselors also have to work with students who have been accused of inflicting the trauma. I'm of the belief of believing and validating the survivor, but I also have the duty of hearing the side of the accused. Do you have any resources or recommendations on how to balance hearing the other side of the story?
Oh, go ahead, Isabella. Sorry.
So, I mean, really, really great question. I think at the end of the day, as a social worker or a social service worker working in that type of community, it's important to recognize that our job is to meet the client who we are working with where they're at, and to support them in any way that they need to, while educating ourselves on both sides. So for example, we can talk about the survivors, we can and their history, but we can also talk about, let's say, the perpetrators and their history, and and I'm hoping I'm understanding and answering your question correctly, but you know, we can understand that some perpetrators, some abusers come from their own history of trauma as well. And so it is important to really educate yourself on trauma and abuse and kind of everything that comes with that in order to work with different populations and different types of people. So I see in your question, you were talking about, or you were asking about resources. I personally do not, none really come to mind, but as you mentioned, you believe that validating the survivor, but also hearing the other side, which, you know, that is your job. And again, just supporting the person where they're at. I'm not sure if I answered your question. I'm not sure if Tanya wants to maybe jump in and add anything.
Well, yeah, I would say in this case, obviously it's an awkward, sensitive situation. And I do agree, of course, that there is a duty to hear the other person. If we're going to say we're democratic, we have to act that way. And that's part of the process, right? Everyone deserves that. I think it really depends. Clearly, an investigation of some sort would have to happen, whether that's within, let's say, an institution, or if the person decides they want to proceed from more of a criminal side of things. At that point, really, the situation would be out of our direct hands, I think, right? And it's best to leave it at at that level. But certainly, I believe everybody does have the right to be heard, regardless, right? And the only other thing I would add to that, of course, is if you're in discussion with both parties, is to make sure you do it separately. By all means, don't put them in the same room together from a practical approach. That would not work well. And I think you'd find that most helpful to do it that way.
Can I just add that as far as resources go, I know that I worked in Brantford, so I can only speak to one area, but the women's shelter actually there had a program for men who are perpetrators. So there is those programs. I think they're not well advertised as far as easy to find them, but maybe talk to some of the crisis centers and women's centers in your area, because they might have good programming for people who who are on the other side of it and maybe you're looking for support.
Thanks to all three of you. I see one question actually in the chat, and we could consider this our last question for now, as we're right up against 2 o'clock. I was wondering if you could discuss setting boundaries when offering support or sharing your story, the importance of checking in with yourself to see if you are emotionally available to support someone, and how to gently arrange another time to discuss their story with them. I think normalizing this is important.
Yes, definitely important when, as I mentioned before, like checking your own biases, knowing what your boundaries are. And I think just as a general rule, it's so important to ask yourself before you share anything personal, is this crossing my boundaries, and is this going to benefit this person's recovery? We need to acknowledge that we're all humans and we all have our own experiences, and sometimes sharing a personal detail can be beneficial, but again, always knowing where to draw that line. For example, not giving really specific details, names, ages, or staying a little bit more surface level, as if you were telling a story. I've done it in the past where I've given a scenario where the client or the survivor does not know that this is something that has happened to me, but it's more of a scenario. So they can't really put 2 and 2 together, if that makes sense. I'm just reading that question again, just to make sure I understood properly and I'm fully answering it. Yeah, absolutely. Normalizing, showing them your human side, I think is really important. Yeah, it sounds like you know, and you have your own answers, and I'm here to validate that for you. I think you're on the right track with what you're thinking.
And I'd also like to add to that when you are in discussion with someone and you see them exercising their own boundaries, it's really important to point that out and reaffirm, like, wow, look at that, you did that. So then as they become more comfortable with that concept of exercising their own boundaries, you can also additionally feel extra comfortable with doing the same in return. It won't be a big surprise or anything to them, right? It's like a give and take. It's very reciprocal. So acknowledge it.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And thank you all for being willing to field some of these questions that are obviously the answers all are in many cases shades of gray. And I can see just in the chat right now, we've had a comment regarding the boundaries that are set between formal investigations process when it has to do with a criminal investigation versus providing support. We don't unfortunately have time to dive into a whole discussion on that in more depth at the moment. But I was going to say to all of the people who are still in attendance, we will be archiving the presentation on our website. And I know our panelists, I believe, are willing to provide some more resources in terms of how to get in touch with the centers they're connected to, as well as potentially their own contact information for further follow-up. So happy to share that information after the fact. And I'll pass it to the panelists. Any final thoughts, comments before we wrap up?
I just wanted to say thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It feels really good knowing that violence against women or sexual violence in general is an important topic, and to see so many people interested in learning more about it and how to support survivors is a really, really inspiring and gratifying feeling. So I just want to thank you all for joining us, and for everyone for being respectful, as this can be a triggering topic as well. So yeah, just thank you for having us and listening.
And I'd also like to say thank you to everybody. It really is a privilege to be here. I think it's wonderful that all of you have taken this initiative. Whether you know much about sexual violence, trauma, any of these concepts and realities, this is the first step, is educating yourselves and being open to learning more and to looking for ways. What can I do? Can I do something? It doesn't matter if it's big or it's small or whatever, anything you can do to work with this issue so that it's no longer an issue. That's our hope, obviously. We have a long way to go, but hopefully we'll get there. And this is all part of it. Thank you so much for attending. And thank you to Isabella, to Alex, and to Chris, of course, for having us all here today.
Thank you very much, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you in the next edition of our webinar series, and greatly appreciate your attendance as always. And thanks again to all the panelists for putting all the hard work into making this a reality.
Thank you.